I'm going to take off a couple of points that Dr. Sunaina Singh made early on, that her university and other places, there may be courses being offered on Indian subjects, but there may not be enough of an interest amongst students, maybe just a few, but not the numbers that we want. So the question arises, why is that happening? And I was having a conversation with one of you the other night, and he said what's happened in the last 300 or 400 years after the Enlightenment is that the Western idea of universalism triumphed. And it has been going strong, and it's been internalized in India as well. And although a lot of Indians, maybe everybody is aware of the Indian perspective, the Upanishads and so on, they think it doesn't have the kind of value that the Western universal narrative has. And therefore, they would rather do that. And maybe at some point in time in their lives, they would come back to it at a personal level. So this is the reason why I thought I would take this as a starting point to step back and look at the very premise of this claim of the triumph of Western universalism. And where does it stand now? And is there any place for the Indian view? Because I would like to make the case in the next 4 or 5 minutes that I have, that perhaps there is also an Indian universal perspective on the world, and maybe there are enough reasons, if you step back and look at what's the larger currents, that things might change. And if that changes, then one would see a lot more people trying to understand the world in a different way. And to put this in context, I go back to the little story I mentioned on Monday evening, about this huge study with a lot of investment by the US government in getting 30-odd leading scientists and physicists and computer scientists and philosophers and neuroscientists together to see where science is going, not necessarily in the next 5, 10, 15 years, but say 50 or 100 years. And I was one of them, and the conclusion that people arrived at, they were not talking about culture stories from different parts of the world. They were looking at the whole problem from the perspective of science and logic. And the conclusions, and there was only one Indian, that was me. They were Americans and Europeans. So about half of them said that the way to approach reality is shunyata, the madhyamika system. Shunyata, there is nothing. There's nothing but emptiness, and out of that arises the mind. And we are, of course, we have minds, and society and science and everything comes out of it. And the other half said, well, there is something more than shunyata, which is, the Atman, which transcends the minds. And therefore, the conclusion was, there was a split, 50% people believing that computers will eventually become conscious, which of course leads to very frightening possibilities, because if computers are conscious, they won't need us, and perhaps humanity will be finished. And the other 50% believing that there was a fundamental difference, and this principle of Atman is what distinguishes us from machines. And that is the Indian universalism, because what is the Indian universal idea? The Western universal idea was that we are all things and objects, right? That's how after Newton and his successors, this whole approach of looking at classical mathematical principles and applying them not only to physical objects or chemistry and biology, but also to society developed. But all that approach has reached a kind of a dead end in different perspectives. It's reached a dead end in physics itself because only the theories that we have exclude 96% of the physical cosmos, which is dark matter and dark energy. And all of the sciences, including biology or psychology, have no place for self. And there is something called self, because we all are convinced, even though somebody else might tell us that we are automata or we do things only by instinct. We are sure there's something much more. And then we have anecdotal accounts of individuals, creativity, and so on, and some of which I did go over, so I'm not going to repeat myself. Now, I just want to address very briefly this split between shunyata, generally called the Buddhist perspective on reality, and Vedanta, which is where people were at. Now, the series of workshops, week-long workshops we had, were not for people who were very knowledgeable about the sutras and all that. But it so turns out that in the Mahayana Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the Buddha, when he was dying, is approached by his disciples, and they're crying, and then they say, you're going to go away. What's going to happen of us? And then he gives this sermon, which is one of the great scriptures of Mahayana Buddhism, where he says that, look, I did in all these years, in all these decades, say that there is not Atman. This is the doctrine of anatta or anatma. But I said that for the following reason. Just as a little baby who's being given the breast by his mother, let's say he falls sick, and this is the story, I'm trying to paraphrase it, falls sick, and the mother goes to the doctor. The doctor says, the baby should be put on this medication for so many days, and the baby should not have your milk. And after the baby has recovered, then the baby can come back to the milk. So, so the baby, she comes back with the medication, and the baby starts crying. The baby says, I want milk. And she says, look, there's something wrong. She puts something bitter on her breast, and she says, there's poison, and you cannot drink the milk. And so the baby cries, and after a few days, the baby becomes well, and then she washes off that bitter thing, and then she tells the baby that it's now okay. I told this to you because it was not good for you. And then the Buddha concludes. He says, you were all too attached to the idea of Atman, which is why I felt it was necessary for you to be separated from that attachment. But now that you have lived all this life as my disciples and gained the necessary insight and wisdom and compassion about all, now you can come back to the idea of Atman. So in other words, in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the Buddha eventually does embrace the Veda, which is an amazing thing. So in other words, all the scientists that we were there did agree that this idea of Indian universalism, which is the same as Western universalism, excepting there is an added transcending category of Atman, of consciousness, which is all for everybody. It's a universal idea. And this is the idea which is going to change the world in many, many different ways. Because in certain ways, this is the most dangerous time for humanity. And we mentioned that briefly the other day, because AI and computer technology is going to make human beings redundant. And if we were really nothing but machines, then even if we had all food to eat and access to the internet and access to watching as many movies as we wanted, we wouldn't be happy with it for too long. Maybe as we are growing up as children, maybe in the 20s, what they've discovered is at some point you would be extremely unhappy. And there is at least the claim that all the opioid epidemic deaths, 70,000 last year in the US, and these are people in the prime of their lives, in their 30s, young parents. Why are they doing it? Is because this Western universal idea, universalism, which did wonderful things because it made science grow to where it has reached, which is astonishing stuff that we've gotten access to, but it's most certainly run its course. And the world is ready for another idea, the idea of science plus, science meaning outer science, plus the idea of consciousness, which is why the smart people everywhere in all fields are talking about the need for the development of a science of consciousness, which is, of course, nothing but the Veda. The Veda is the science of consciousness. What the Veda says is that there is rit, meaning laws and order, which works. Everything is ordered. But paradoxically on the surface, there is consciousness which electrifies everything, which provides the basis of all that happens. And it was expressed in all amazing ideas, and I'll just talk about two of them. One is the idea of Ishvara. We have Shiva is the witness within each one of us, right? Now, as we know, those of us who have looked at yantra diagrams, in the tantric tradition, you have the Sri Chakra, for example, which is a representation of the cosmos, both the outer cosmos and the physical cosmos, or the inner cosmos. But as you know, at the very center of the Sri Chakra is an invisible dot, and that is Shiva. So what does it really mean? It means that the more you look for consciousness within you, because it's not an object, you will not find it. Shiva is, or Atman, or consciousness, is the experiencing subject who is one. There are not many objects. And now, to conclude, Dr. Sunaina Singh tells me that my time is almost up, maybe a minute. And we all do know that the astonishing advances in modern science were also informed by Indian ideas. Not everybody is aware of it. For example, the development of quantum mechanics itself by Schrödinger, who was a Vedantist, an Austrian, brought in consciousness, because quantum mechanics, consciousness, and the physical universe are a complementary pair. Then the whole wireless revolution, E is equal to mc square. Vivekananda and Nikola Tesla met in 1896. Sarah Bernhardt threw a party in New York City, and Vivekananda told Nikola Tesla, who's one of the most famous guys of his times in the 1890s, that look, according to Vaisheshika, mass, ultimately mass and energy are interconvertible. So he said, can you find the math for it? And of course, he was beaten to it by Albert Einstein. Although there is a theory, I don't know whether it's a sound theory, that as we know, Einstein's wife was a Serbian, and she had been in correspondence with Tesla, who was the most famous Serbian of his times. And so there are some people, probably not with irrefutable evidence, who suggest that perhaps the germ of the idea may have come to Einstein from Tesla through his wife. So with this, I conclude. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'd be glad to, amplify any of this should you have questions.